Hello, everybody, and welcome to another of the Nautical Institute's webinars. I'm David Petrayko with the Nautical Institute headquarters here in London, and I'm being joined by Eric Holliday from his office in New Zealand. And I've been told to watch out for shaking moments because they've been having some earthquakes lately. So good morning, Eric, or good evening.
Hello, David. Yeah.
No. So just before we start, I just want to tell you how things are going to go. The webinar in total will be about an hour. I'm trying not to go too much over an hour. And there'll be a 30-minute presentation followed by about a half an hour of questions and answers. So just some housekeeping notes. You'll see you have a control panel in front of you, and it can be collapsed or expanded with that little white arrow in the orange field that's on the top. And when it's expanded, you will see that you can ask some questions. So type in some questions. You can do it anytime during the presentation or during the Q&A. If you do me a favor by keeping the questions fairly short and concise, that'll make my job a little bit easier to spot them. There are also 3 handouts that you can download if you're interested, with a little bit more information on what we're going to talk about and some resources from the Nautical Institute. So we'll also spring a poll on you when you least expect it. And you'll find a screen like this, and you need to click in one of these buttons, and it's kind of hard to hit the target. So just try. Some people find it a little bit difficult, but it does work. At the end, when we stop the webinar, you'll get a little pop-up questionnaire. Would appreciate your comments and your feedback so that we can help improve our performance. And in a couple hours after the webinar, you will get an email message and a link to a CPD certificate with your name on it. So I think that's just about it for housekeeping. Just to let you know, there are about 400 of you registered, so you're in good company. Right, so now I will formally introduce our guest, Eric Holliday. Eric is a mariner. He went to sea some years ago as an engineer, but you know, we forgive him that. He has spent many years in the safety industry as a safety manager, a safety consultant, and a lecturer. So, Eric, over to you. Thank you very much.
Right, David, thanks very much. Just checking, you got my screen there?
Yep, everything looks good, Eric.
Right. So welcome everybody. As David said, hopefully we won't have any shaking earthquakes. We've had a run of them for about 2 weeks. If there's anybody else in New Zealand listening to this, yeah, it's been interesting times. What we talking about today is human contributions to safety, and it's a massive subject. So what I've chosen to do is just have some random thoughts, and it really is simply a case of what is this human side to safety? How does it tie into a whole number of things? You would have seen from the promo that we sent out, we talk about safety first, and that's normally the first thing that gets shown and spoken about. Unfortunately, sometimes we mess it up in terms of what our bridge looks like or what our ship looks like. This poor fellow really messed it up, and we end up with saying like no safety and smoking first. I'm sure that's not the intention. So just needing to do that. There we go. Sorry, guys. So we normally start off with it with a statement: people are our greatest assets, and that's great. And then somebody will come along and say, people cause accidents. It's all about human error. And then we get the statement somewhere safety.
Hello. Oh, there he is. He's back. Sorry, Eric, you lost the signal for a moment.
Oh, okay. I'm back.
You're back.
Okay, sorry. We're also storming out here in New Zealand at the moment. So for those who lost the signal, this is kind of how the conversation goes. Anything from people are our greatest asset all the way to let's remove people and automate. And we end up with the automation thing being chucked around the whole time. Clearly, that's not what we want to be talking about. And this is what this presentation is about, is about the people side of that. Just some background: when I started off in the safety field, in the maritime safety field almost 30 years ago, I guess, I saw a statement and it said the following, and I've always found it really interesting. This guy was saying, I cannot accept that accidents only before the incompetent. And increasingly he was asking himself, how is it that competent people in beneficial surroundings can make serious mistakes? It was with the UK Coast Guard Agency. But think about that. How is it that competent people in beneficial surroundings make serious mistakes? In much of our industry, we have competent people working on some really good ships, and we're still having accidents. As I said, these are random thoughts, so let's think about safety. What is safety? The definition I have, and David, maybe this is a good time to put the poll on. The definition I have is safety is the ability to see the accident before it happens, and then putting the necessary measures in place to prevent it happening. Now, if you think about that.
Sorry, Eric, the poll is running, so I'll leave it up there for about a minute while you talk over it, Eric.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Now, this statement of mine, safety is the ability to see the accident before it happens. Many years back, I had a client in South Africa, a big fishing company, and I was running a 2-day training course there. And at the end of the first day, I had another client visit in the port, and I drove across to them, and I had 20 minutes to wait, and parked up on a hill and looked down on this specific fishing company that I was working at the aquaculture organization. And I clearly remember seeing a working boat, aquaculture working boat, going up and going up to the aquaculture farm, and they were going to pull up the ropes with the mussels and all types of things on. But the thing that caught my eye was a guy standing on deck, and he had a yellow oilskin on, but no life jacket. There were no life rings, there was no safety harness, and clearly with aquaculture boats, they have gaps in the railings. And I just remember thinking, what if that guy falls overboard? What would happen? What are the safety measures that? So in my mind, I was seeing this accident happening. Anyway, I thought to myself, I need to speak to the safety manager the next day. Next day came along, totally forgot about it. And I was literally an hour and a half into my safety training for the day when one of the directors walked in and said, Eric, we're shutting the place down. We're sending people home. And I said, why? And he said, we have just lost one of our guys off the mussel barge. He fell overboard and he drowned. And it was their first fatality in 10 years in this operation. And I saw it happen in my mind the night before. So I've always remembered that. So for me, safety is the ability to see the accident before it happens, and then putting the necessary measures in place to prevent it happening. And that's where we all done with the poll, Dave?
Yeah, I'm just sharing the not quite so surprising results.
Okay, we'll have a look at that later. Thanks. So yeah, as I said, we'll go back to this definition. We look at risk as one of the concepts too in the definition. But think of safety that way: is that ability to see the accident before it happens, and then putting the steps in place to prevent it. Again, one of my consultancy experiences back off the coast of Namibia, this is a picture taken on a offshore diamond mining ship, and the big yellow thing you see is a 140-ton tractor that gets dropped 60 meters into the water. This is auto controlled, goes along the seabed, sucks up diamonds and crayfish and rocks and all types of things, kicks the rocks and the crayfish back into the sea. There's a fully automated diamond mine on board. Anyway, this thing running along the seabed, the big yellow tractor, obviously requires a whole bunch of maintenance, and I happened to be walking along as part of an audit and saw this taking place. Here's a guy standing on a 44-gallon drum with the blue drums is water and hydraulic fluid, a mixture of that. He's standing, he's not wearing his harness as he should, he's not wearing his life jacket as he should. The photo I haven't shown that he's not wearing his helmet. And these guys had custom-made aluminium scaffolding put in place for them just for this job. So the question is, why are they doing this? Can't they see the potential for slipping? It's on a ship, it's a wonky setup that he's got there, and the potential for an accident there. Interesting story to this is 3 weeks after this picture was taken, and after the mine manager on board said to me, Eric, that doesn't matter, we just need to get the job done. There was an accident, and 3 guys landed up in the water and were incredibly lucky to survive. But that's a whole nother story. When you move on and you look at the stuff that we in the industry are faced with all the time, simple, if it can be simple, pilot transfer. We know accidents happen on a continuous basis there, and it's a case of how do we deal with that? Accident is the ability to see the accident before it happens, and then putting those measures in place. Another picture. Here we have 2 chaps cleaning out a cargo hold, and you've got to think, what is the thought process? Was he commanded to be there? Was there not a culture of safety on the vessel? Was there anything he could have done? Was anything in his power? These are all part of the human contributions to this thing we call safety at sea. Moving on, there's a really old, if another concept out of this accident, there's a really old tried and tested definition to an accident, and it says quite simply, an accident is an undesired event generally caused by some combination of unsafe acts, and that's the thing that we're looking at, and unsafe conditions, and then resulting in a loss or potential for loss. And again, you look at the design over here, clearly an unsafe condition, there's an unsafe act taking place. This is generally accepted or not. Sometimes accidents are big. If we have anybody from New Zealand joining us now, the arena of our East Coast a few years back, again, a combination of unsafe acts and unsafe conditions resulting in some sort of loss. And it doesn't have to be big spectacular accidents like this. I was working up in Canada a few years back, and I happened to look online at one of the local newspapers, and there was an example of a youngster who clearly thought he could text and drive fast at the same time. Clearly it didn't work all that well for him. So when we bring all this stuff together and we start looking at investigating accident, there's a chap called James Reason. A number of you will be familiar with the Swiss cheese model that we use, and it's a really great model for breaking down and analyzing parts of or contributions, causation to an accident. And without going into the whole explanation there, again, the part that we're interested in is this thing we call unsafe acts, the stuff people do along the way. And one of the things I've clearly learned in my work with aviation or with the maritime industry is learn from other industries. 20 years ago, I think it was just on 2000, Air France hit a 14-inch piece of steel lying on a runway, and fuel burst out, burst the tire, which then hit a tank, pressurized the tank, fuel streamed out, caught a light, the plane went down, everybody on board, 109 on board got killed, and I think there were 4 that got killed in a hotel on the ground. Now that was again a combination of unsafe acts and unsafe condition. Interesting in this case, the unsafe act wasn't so much the Air France pilot, but the service technician on a Continental Airlines back in the States who used a rogue piece of metal as opposed to the proper standard fixing up of engine cowling. And 2 or 3 days later, this fell off at Charles de Gaulle Airport, and this Air France Concorde, who, and don't get me wrong, there were a number of other issues as well with the Air France operation over there, came to grief. And so yeah, so it's interesting, this combination of unsafe acts, unsafe conditions. I guess if you had an operation lately, you might not want to look at that. But if we want to understand accidents and we do accident investigation, there's a number of questions that need to be answered. And the standard ones and the easy ones are the how, what, where, when, and who. The really difficult thing is why. So why do accidents happen? And when we start looking at why, it's inevitable that the term human error starts being popped up. And I'll show the following pictures without too much commentary at all. But is that human error? Was that human error? Was that human error? And if you look at the definition, then one of the definitions of human error that I particularly like, it talks about a departure from accepted or desirable practice on the part of an individual or group of individuals that can or does result in unacceptable and undesirable behavior. Again, there's another one. The misinterpretation of information essential to the correct execution of an action. So you start looking at human error and you start tying it to unsafe acts. But that's complicated, because once you start doing that, the natural inclination is then to blame the operator, the person at the sharp end, the person who did or didn't do the thing. But that leads us into a whole nother interesting thing. If you look at, again, aviation industry, they talk about HVACs, which is a model that they have. And when they look at unsafe acts within that, they very clearly look at 2 bits: errors, and these are potentially decision errors or skill-based or perceptual errors, or violations, and they are 2 very, very different beasts. When you start looking at violations, in other words, an unsafe act that's been done on purpose, then we go into the whole realm of rogue behavior, and this is a term we know at sea. And David, here's a plug for the Nautical Institute's alert program. This particular spread comes from the alert program, and for those of you who don't know, please check it out online. The alert program was a 40-issue project that NI ran over, I think it was 12 or 13 years. Fantastic information over there, and in fact, the training that our organization does with NI works very much and refers back to the alert program on a regular basis. If you look at the bottom left-hand or bottom right-hand picture over there, probably the aviation accident where rogue behavior was very clearly implicated was Tenerife in 1977. I think it was 27th of March, and that's the case, or that's the accident where 2 747s collided on the ground in Tenerife. And if you're interested in rogue behavior, if you're interested in the human element in any way, do yourself a favor and have a good read and investigation into that accident. It is probably the classic human factor aviation accident. Take us. We're talking about human error, we're talking about perception, we're talking about all types of things. The model that we like using is this cognitive model for interacting safely with a hazard. And if you look at that, really what it is. It's a model that says where you're exposed to some sort of hazard or a hazard situation, you need 4 things to work through that safely. You need the correct perception, you need to understand it correctly, in other words, the cognition, you need to make the right decision to interact with it, and you need to have the physical and mental ability to be able to carry out your decision. If you do that, you normally end up with some sort of safe interaction. Anywhere off the rails, anywhere where there's a negative answer to any of the questions in there, you tend to end up with unsafe behavior and quite often an accident. To complicate things, of course, this is real life. It's not a cognitive model only. Issues like stress, fatigue, wellness, alcohol, drugs, all impact on this either collectively or individually or collectively, and impact on perception, cognition, decision-making ability, again, either individually or collectively. Pretty straightforward. What I'll do very quickly is just give you some sort of background into perception. And for the engineers among us, we'll be confused by that, because if we measure the distances between the parallels, they're all absolutely equal. If we trust our eyes, we don't get the same thing. So perception can be seen as this: we don't see reality, we interpret what we see, and we call that reality. And this reality thing is actually real and confusing. If I can give a personal story on that, the first time I flew to New Zealand from at that time home country in South Africa was 20-something years back, and flying across from Singapore to Auckland for the first time, I'd bought a book and I was sitting reading the book, and there was a chap next to me, and we hadn't spoken, we hadn't interacted in any way, but about 2 hours into the trip, he tapped me on the shoulder and said, and turned around and looked really white and sweating profusely and all signs of distress. And he said, would you mind not reading that book? And the book that I had was called Black Box. And for me, as a human factors specialist, this was fascinating stuff. It was about decision-making, cognition, and perceptions. For him, this was his reality. We were going to die. And so perception couldn't be described better than that. His perception, his understanding, what he saw, how his body reacted, was absolutely real for him. So perception is an interesting beast. Another very quick example there. Years ago, I was training in Arizona, I think it was, and part of the training was the students had to tell me what this picture was. And clearly, it's the outline of a cow's head. I mean, everybody can see that. And while these guys were doing this thing, I walked behind a group and looked down, and they had the picture open, this picture open, working on that. And I just packed out laughing. And I walked to the front of the team and I said, do you mind if I take a photograph? And at this stage, they looked even more perplexed. Why would I want to take a photograph? And all I said to them was, we're not staging this photo at all. All I'd like you to do is just take the cup that you're drinking coffee out of and turn it through 180 degrees for me, please. I then took the photograph. If you look at the cup down there, it's exactly that picture. You can see it right in front of his chest there. He had the answer right in front of him, and he clearly couldn't see it. The poor chap on the right, I don't think he saw anything the whole day, but that's a whole nother story. So perception is an interesting beast. It's what we see generally, but also what we feel, what we taste, what we perceive. Of course, that means nothing unless we talk about cognition, which is the process by which this knowledge is acquired, stored, recalled, and revised, and involves that perception, memory, and thinking, and decision-making, and all types of things. That's the brain power out there. Now, without going into a great big human factors and psychological breakdown, that what it means is that the instructions that you give, whether it's to people at sea or whether it's at sea, need to make sense. This is a area of evacuation assistance for people with disabilities. The thing says alternate exit to the left, then right, then left, then right, then left to exit. When you're using this, there's smoke and flames and everything is turned to crap. So it's not a very good sign. Now, the thing that bothers me is somebody wrote it, somebody printed it, somebody pasted it up there, somebody probably instructed people on that, and they probably walked past 1,000 times. A hell of a lot easier is to have a sign that's at a zoo where there's a croc, or for our American friends, an alligator in there. So you stay on one side of the fence, the croc stays the other side. That's good. You don't go run with a croc. You don't go swim with a croc. You don't put your head over the thing, and you don't feed the croc. Those are all bad ideas. Talking about our American Canadian friends, I was up in Canada some time back and walking through an old village, and they had gone with their times and put those 3 boxes that you can see in front of the picture there with holes on for recycling and for trash. But there was also a sign above that said public washrooms. And in Canada, toilets are washrooms. So I'm not sure how many people have actually thought that those holes over there might be the very public washrooms. It's about understanding, and our understanding is formed by our experiences and what we go through. More than 100 years ago, this fine gentleman said, you know, he'd been through storms, he'd never been in a wreck, he wasn't concerned about anything. I never saw a wreck and never been wrecked, nor was there ever in a predicament that threatened to end in disaster of any sort. And clearly we know how that ended up. So be very careful about basing your decisions and your background on what you know. I'll put this picture in for aviation friends again. What is the thought process here? This is an owner filling up his you know, the fuel tanks on his plane. He's probably done this 100 times. Safety is the ability to see the accident before it happens. We have to understand risk to understand whether there's a danger. We're normally faced with a risk matrix of some sort, and the problem is our perceptions. Now we're back in perceptions again, vary tremendously. The problem is our brain automatically compares the present situation against the standard created in the mind through past experience. But the problem is our mind holds some really interesting standards out there. Think about that. When you show people that, generally there's, oops, that's real danger, I'm getting the hell out of here, because those things are really bad news. You contrast that to lovely coconuts, and once we can all fly again and we go to the Pacific Islands or somewhere else, that's ideal, that's peace. The reality is that many more people are killed every year through coconuts falling on the head than through shark attacks at sea. Something like 12 people per year are killed at sea by sharks. That's it. Many, many more are killed by falling coconuts. So you be careful of what that standard is that's in your head, because that determines how you think about whether something is dangerous or not. So here's a final thought for you on this sequence over here. Don't believe everything you think. And think about that. Don't believe everything you think. Your thinking, the stuff you think is correct, the facts you think are right, might not be. So where do we go from this then? We were speaking about a cognitive model. Do we go into the ISM code? Do we go into safety management systems, those planned, documented, verifiable methods of managing hazards and associated risks? Yeah, we can, but there's a great danger that ISM code and similar codes become tick box exercises. So do they help then with safety culture? Should we be looking at safety culture? Well, a classic accident where safety culture was mentioned was the Herald of Free Enterprise. In fact, at the inquiry, they said from top to bottom, the body corporate was infected with the disease of sloppiness. And this was a statement made about the safety culture. And that leads me to another thing that popped up many years back when I was training a number of ship's masters. And one of them said, Eric, I read a statement once and it said, the accident starts in the office. Now it makes sense. So think about culture, where that starts, what it is. There's a really interesting, if you look at James Reason, again, we go back to James Reason, and this is in depth, so I'll just flick over this, but it's really worth checking this out. James Reason talks about an informed culture. In other words, the organization knows what's going on. It knows what's going on because people are confident and able to report when things go wrong without fear of blame. That learning is then the result of that. So people report, the organization learns, it's flexible, it adapts to things as they happen, but this only works if you have a just culture. And you would have heard the phrase just culture being talked about in industry, and that's a very clear distinction. If we go back to that unsafe act and the error and the violation drawing that I had earlier, that's exactly what. People are clear that it's acceptable to make mistakes because we all make mistakes. It is unacceptable to have deliberate violations of standing orders or standing rules in the workplace. So let's try and close this all off then with talking about risk. Risk is many things, as I said. It could be the matrix, it could be the ISO 31000 standard as our topic there. For me, the easiest one, if you're talking to crew, if you're talking to people about what risk is, it's just we call it safe. It's a safe mnemonic. And quite simply, it's seeing the hazard, assessing the risk, fixing the problem, and evaluating your fix. It's a really simple model because every single person has control over this. They see something is wrong, they work out how bad and how dangerous it is, they fix the problem, and then they come back to see whether it's in fact staying fixed and whether the risk has been reduced. Further problem with risk, however, is we talk about a hierarchy of controls. If you look at the last two there, and those are the least effective ones, it's the people side. So as a former engineer, I'm attracted to the top ones. As somebody who has studied and worked in human factors for the past 30 years, I understand the issues with the bottom ones. And again, a final statement may be about risk and the human element. And I found this in a book called The Book of Risk. It says this: risk management is not and will never be a magic formula that will always give you the right answer. And here's the interesting bit. It says it is a way of thinking that will give you better answers to better questions. And by doing so, help you shift the odds in your favor. It is a way of thinking that will give you better answers to better questions. That's risk management. Finally, in risk competency, another term that we might have heard chucked around. Well, let's go back to our Ramsey model that we spoke about. Seeing the hazard, the perception, it is understanding the risk, the cognition, and is responding correctly, the decision making. We've seen this before. In the maritime industry, we call it situational awareness. If you look at the deadly dozen, this is the first one that comes up: loss of situational awareness as reasons for accidents. So, but these are things we can teach. We can teach people to perceive correctly, to understand correctly, and to make the right decisions. So we go right back to our model before, and this is where I'll unshamedly put a plug in for the training that we're providing. If you look at this model again, and we go back to ability, the Human Performance and Limitations for Mariners HBL course, and the book that the Nautical Institute has, talks very much, it talks about all of the above, but it talks very much about that ability, the person at sea, the psychological side, the physical side, the things that are important over there. And one of the things we talk about is fatigue, and without going into a whole explanation there, I just want to show you one quick study, and you probably would have seen this before. It talks about after 17 hours of sustained wakefulness, psychomotor performance decreases to the same level of impairment that is produced by blood alcohol concentration of 0.05. Now, in New Zealand, that is the driving limit, or the alcohol limit for driving. And we talk about somebody who's been awake for 17 hours is at that same level. When we take that up to 24 hours, we go twice that. So it just gives you some idea of the impairment that is introduced by sustained wakefulness. And finally, this is the course that we're running with the Nautical Institute. We're talking about reducing risk through the human element. We've just updated on the website, so please have a look. If you're interested, please give the Nautical Institute a call. And the two reference books that we work with in that course that we reference all the time is, as I said, the HPL, and we go back to the Safety Alert a compendium that we have over there. From my side, yeah, I forgot I put this in. 40 years ago is a long time. I still had hair then, and I guess if I remember correctly, it was fashionable back in 1980. But certainly, if there's anything we can do, please give us a call on this. And I trust you found this really very short look at some of the considerations of the human element in safety at sea. Interesting. Happy to hand it back to David now and answer any questions. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Eric. Gosh, you've certainly stirred up a lot of questions. Not sure where to start. You talked about the SMS, and that's
Yes.
should be a very important tool that we have. And a vet writes in, and she says recent studies indicate the apparent disconnect between the SMS onboard and onboard reality. How do we bridge this gap truthfully instead of the SMS being a tick box exercise? There's a nice light question to start with.
Thank you. I think my understanding is that the ISM code was brought in specifically to improve the culture of safety at sea. From the feedback that we have from industry, unfortunately, it doesn't always do that. The human bit to that has been left behind, and it becomes, in many cases, a tick box exercise or an exercise to make sure that the right pieces of documentation are in place. And with any safety management system that is process and procedure driven, you have the risk of that happening. The safety management systems that I've seen to be really powerful include people at all levels as crucial aspects of that. The ISM code wasn't written with that specifically in mind.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I mean, it is interesting. One of the things that I've found over the years is that the people who create the safest environment are those who, as you said in your presentation, are continually looking at it. They're continually evaluating it. And it's almost the moment you document it, you're happy, it's documented, you move away, and something happens. Do you see that?
Well, it's certainly in our experience, and not only in maritime, but in all industry. As soon as the safety management system is managed or controlled by one particular person, and often shore-based, that would be a safety manager, then safety seems to become the safety guy's problem. And again, as I said, that disconnect is created there between the people that actually should be operating and should be involved in this thing and the safety manager. It becomes part of the safety manager's KPIs to make sure the documentation's in place, that when there's a audit taking place, that the right answers are given and they go through the audit. Yeah, it is a difficult thing to do. How do you, on a ship where crews are constantly changing, how do you assign parts of that safety management system to particular crew members? In an ideal world, you would do that, but it is difficult.
Thanks, Eric. Another one, a little bit more specific, but follows on from that idea. is how do you make drills and safety discussions more interesting for the crew?
That's an interesting one. And we actually get asked that quite often. My response is there is a thing we use in training. We talked about flipped learning. In other words, we turn the experience on its back. Instead of the first officer running the drill, it might be he might have handed over the responsibility for managing the drill to a new cadet, 2 weeks before the time, and said to the new cadet, you're going to be running the drill in 2 weeks time. You need to find out what needs to get done. You need to manage it. And that way that cadet is then forced to find out exactly, to be involved, as opposed to just being a participant to that process. Certainly when I was at sea, it was easier to duck behind somebody else than that way we won't get asked a question. But if you force people to, if you flip that whole experience and you force people to come out and take control of that process, running a drill, giving a safety talk, presenting it, setting up a onboard PowerPoint presentation on enclosed space or something like that, instead of the safety person, that second mate or whoever's the safety officer on board, instead of that person running it, pass it on to other members of the ship's crew, and you then mentor those people and guide that process. That becomes a really powerful learning experience, not only for the person who's running it, the new cadet, but for others in the group as well, because they know that next week it might be their turn to run with this.
That's a really good idea, Eric. Thank you for that. And I remember when my eyes were first opened to using creativity in onboard drills. We had some first aid trainers come to the ship and ride with us for a few days. And one of the things that they did is they put a lot of effort into the debrief of the drill. And that's something that we quite often don't do enough of on board a ship, because we're all busy. We all want to get back to our tasks. But having that debrief where you talk to everybody, from the lowest rank to the senior rank, and you say what went right, what could be improved. And we did a drill that time on board that I was talking about, where they actually used props and they videotaped it. And
excellent.
The props actually made it so realistic, because I remember they told us all to wait in the mess, and then they said, okay, now you can come out. And all of a sudden there was a guy on the deck with a screwdriver through his leg and blood everywhere. And it got real, and it was fake blood, by the way. I'll just point that out. But it was interesting when we did the debrief with the video, to see people's reactions and see what they were doing and see the context of the exercise. So that was very powerful and very enjoyable.
Well, there's actually a parallel to that, David, in terms of that very simple mnemonic that I gave: SAFE, see, assess, fix, and evaluate. It's that final, when you've dealt with a safety problem, you've seen it, you've assessed it, you've fixed it. That evaluation bit, that debrief, is the critical bit. Have we done it right? So there's a clear parallel between these processes: debriefing after a safety exercise, and evaluating after you fixed up a safety problem. There's that final step is very similar.
Thanks, Eric. Right, so questions are just piling in here, so let's see if we can raise some of them. Interesting comment by Gordon. He says safety is doing the right thing even when no one is looking. That's kind of nice. But then he goes up. Actually,
Gordon, if I can add to that, what is really interesting, I talk about safety culture. Another of those definitions is saying exactly that, doing the right thing. And then I always add to that, when the boss isn't looking, because then you know you have a true culture, a true safety culture, when you're doing the right thing, as you say, when the boss isn't watching.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And we got another one here from Gareth. What are your thoughts on how seafarers are affected by work pressure, low manning, poor conditions, long tour lengths, and mental health issues?
Wow. It's a massive problem. Interesting, when I started looking at maritime safety back in the late 80s, I'd left the sea at that stage. I was shoreside working in engineering, but I wanted to keep connected to the maritime industry in some way. I started studying human factors at university, and one of the theses that we did, or that I did, was looking at the link between reduced manning at that time, really pertinent in the late 80s, and increased stress levels, and looked at things like the mental health, looking at the workloads. Sadly, 30 years down the line, we are still looking at exactly the same things. We shouldn't be, but we are. They are massive problems. We know, for instance, when we do this training, when we do the training with the Nautical Institute, we talk about the suicide rate of seafarers. That's something like 3 times the shoreside average. So those are terrible statistics. We know about the other pressures that there are, about workloads. We talk in the course, we talk about fatigue. We make it very clear that fatigue management, or fatigue risk management, goes way beyond simply the working hours of the seafarer on the job at sea, but it takes into account a whole bunch of other factors. And sadly, in our industry, there's still much work to be done on this whole mix between reduced manning, increased stress, increased fatigue, mental health issues, suicide. It's an ongoing battle. One of the things we want to do with the Nautical Institute training is get shore-based personnel involved, to management personnel ashore, get involved with them. I always believe that the more information you can give people in charge, people who make up rosters, people who get involved with manning levels, the better it is for those of us who are still at sea. But a massive problem.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It is, and more so now in this pandemic state. And I just want to point out to everyone that there is a lot of free guidance and support available. We have a section of our website, notinst.org, where you can find links to this. There are welfare organizations out there. There are hotlines. There are some really good quality movies and training films about it. We have many links on our website, but if you just Google maritime welfare, you'll find a lot out there to help you. So it's really important stuff. Right, we've got a question from Evgeny about PPE. You have lots of examples in your presentation about people not using PPE. Why?
Good question. Again, PPE is remember that we showed that slide about the hierarchy of controls, and I said the bottom 2 are the least effective ones, and that includes things like relying solely on personal protective equipment for risk reduction. So much better if we can engineer safety in. As I showed that picture of the guy cleaning inside the hold, standing right up. Yep, we could provide him, and we should have provided him there with a harness that's connected, that should he slip. But is it a task that needs to be done? Could we engineer it out? Could we have portable railings up there, which is the engineering safety thing, as opposed to relying on personal protective equipment alone? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes personal protective equipment is the only viable protective piece over there, and we have to have it. And clearly, when I work with organizations right across the spectrum, if personal protective equipment is the only piece of safety or piece of the safety puzzle that can be provided or can be done, then it has to be done. And there needs to be education, there needs to be the provision of this PPE, and there has to be a very clear expectation that the operators, the people that need it, then use it correctly and wear it. It goes back to that just culture bit. If somebody has been, in my mind, if somebody has been provided with PPE, they've been trained in the use of PPE, they know they have to use PPE, and then they don't, then it's an unsafe act, but it's a violation of the standard. They've done that on purpose. If they don't wear it because they don't know how to, or they don't wear it because they didn't know they had to in that area, that is a mistake, and that needs to be then sorted out. So it's the whole question of the just culture, knowing what is acceptable and clearly knowing what is not acceptable. But it's a difficult thing because PPE is a very personal thing, and certainly in the 40 years since I left the sea, that's changed tremendously, and the emphasis has changed tremendously. I see pictures of engineers with helmets in the engine room. I was lucky if I had hearing protection. So,
well, also you couldn't have gotten a helmet over that hair. So
maybe that's why I grew it, just in case something dropped on my head.
Yeah. So I mean that reminds me, we do a lot of work on human-centered design, and it's involving the users all along. And one of the things that we keep coming up against is the unsafe acts around enter into enclosed spaces on board, and that's where I think certainly some real design improvements could be made. Right. So we go on. This question comes from Will. Eric, do you think human error is a useful term in safety improvement, or does it set up barriers to improvement?
Well, that's interesting. I actually agree with you. It is a term that has negative connotations. On the other side, we have to accept that as humans, we make errors, we make mistakes. In fact, the psychologist will tell you that we do, I think that the figure's about 11 or 12 mistakes every hour of the day. So clearly, humans making mistakes, humans having errors is something that's out there. If you couple that, however, to an organization with a very clear safety culture, just culture, then we accept that people make mistakes. We accept that people make errors, or people have errors. It is the other part of that equation, which is then the negative side, the violation, where they do things unsafely with intent, which needs to be the thing. Except that we make errors. We do it all the time. You get home and you drive, and you'll pull out in front of somebody while you're driving, and you think, what the hell have I done? That was a mistake. We make mistakes all the time. It's a part of the human psyche. I understand that, as I said, sometimes there's a negative connotation to that. There shouldn't have to be. We all make mistakes. But if it creates barriers where you're working, then let's find something else, find another term, but deal with it in the same way.
Thanks, Eric. Needless to say, your little poll started some controversy.
Oops.
No, you knew it would.
That's why it's there.
Yeah, okay. So technology versus people, automation, does it assist And just to start off the debate, James has written in, your poll was potentially misleading. You can train as much as you like, but people must take responsibility for their actions. Automation, this is what he believes, that automation can help more than 94%, he thinks. Now, just before you take that, it reminds me of a comment that Elon Musk made one time when people were saying that people could still be harmed with autonomous cars. And he says, absolutely, people will continuously be harmed with autonomous cars. But according to him, he will find success when 10 times less people are harmed by autonomous cars than cars driven by humans. So this comes back to your as low as practically possible graph, I suppose. So we only have a few minutes left, but talk a little bit about where you see the balance of increased technology and automation coming into the safety game, and how, as maritime professionals, you and I both work at the IMO and with international organizations, how do we hold that debate so we get the balance right to get technology to support people and improve safety?
Look, clearly there's a place for technology. Clearly, I mean, it goes without saying. And there are some fantastic additions and advantages that technology can bring. I guess my principal beef, or my principal worry about this, is that the people designing the technological improvements or the technology on board the vessels are quite often very remote from the people that need to use it and operate with that. And that causes tremendous problems. You know, the old term is what I'm referring to is ergonomics. You know, designing the workplace to fit the performance levels and limitations of humans. And often there's this discord between the two. Technology has an absolute place in the whole process, but we have to work with the people that are at sea and that are using these bits of technology. Interesting, just as a quick aside, I spoke earlier about my original thesis about looking at stress and fatigue and reduced manning. At that stage, and as I remind you, this was the late 80s, I think, when I did this piece of work, there was a very clear drive by, I believe, the Japanese government to have fully autonomous ships by the year 2000. That was going to be the future. We're now sitting at 2020, and we're still having the debate. I'd much rather change the debate and see how can we use technology to aid safe operation. We're still seeing human error accidents that could have been prevented through better use of technology. So that's my only comment there. We accept that technology can and should be a very clear part of what we do, but speak to the people at sea and see what they need.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And looking at the clock here, I see we are starting to come to the end of the session. Interesting about the technology. We published an article in March Seaways, and that's our journal. For you members who are watching, you'll have a record of that in March. And it was a big survey that we did about the role of automation on board. And I think we got a very pragmatic feedback from people. And you would have thought that mariners would be anti-automation, but they're not at all, because they do recognize that a lot of the automation, well, there already is a lot of automation on board ships, in engineering and cargo, certainly in navigation, and some of it is very useful. There is a huge role for increased automation to play in reducing fatigue, for example.
Yes.
It can do a lot of automated reporting. It can do a lot of automated tasks that now are done manually on board and lead to so much fatigue. It can see things sometimes better than the human can. It can see things sometimes better than the human eye can. So we're seeing, particularly on some of these big container ships, we're seeing them equipped with optical sensors and LiDAR systems, and to help inform the bridge. But then you have the issue of data and information. When is it useful? When is it too much? When is it distracting? So I suppose you're right, Eric. The big thing is that we have to make sure that the users are kept in the loop. And I know in aviation they have something called LOSA, which
Yes.
I have tried to bring into the maritime over the years. And it's a line operator safety assessment. And it's a trained professional who sits in the cockpit and watches what happens. And they can comment on 3 different things. Now, in the maritime industry, the first is observation of competency. And yep, we can do that. We're pretty good at observing competencies. The second is looking at procedures. Now, those might be company procedures, or they might even be regulations. And I think it's very important that we encourage people at sea that if they see an unhelpful procedure, whether it's a company procedure or regulation, that they let somebody know so that we can try to do that. But the third thing they do in aviation that we haven't gotten to is they can comment on design. If they see a design, a system design, bad ergonomics, et cetera, in aviation, they just write to ICAO and get it sorted. But in maritime, if mariners see a design that might be dangerous or hazardous, what do they do? Who do they tell? So we have to get better at that. And the answer is you can always write to the Nautical Institute. We're not promising to save the world, but we will certainly try our best. So,
actually,
Eric,
if I could just add a final comment there. You brought up something really interesting, and that's the aviation industry. And you would have seen in my short presentation, I use examples from the aviation industry on a fairly regular basis, and there's a very good reason for that. The same people that are taking ships around the world are the same people who fly airplanes. The human side to interacting with these complex machines, whether it's at sea or whether it's in the air, are exactly the same. And as an industry, I believe we need to take a lot more cognizance of what's happening in aviation. Look at the accidents, look at their research, look at their studies. I think there's a lot for us in the industry to gain from that. And accident investigation, looking at what they do following an aviation accident is a really good way to get started. So yeah, I'm glad you brought up the aviation industry. I think there's a big role for us to expand beyond simply the maritime side and keep looking at that, but look outside and what are the comparable lessons to be learned. Thank you.
We do. We look at aviation a lot and other industries as well. But I think it's very important to state they look at maritime as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's good to learn from other industries, but it's good to understand what we ourselves are capable of. And it's not always what somebody else does that's better. We have a lot of good practices that we should be proud of. Just before I end, I got a last message here. We've had so many messages, and we'll try to do some of them in writing. But it says, what was that abbreviation? And it's LOSA, L-O-S-A, Line Operation Safety Assessment. Just Google it, you'll find loads on it. Brings me back to the point, a number of people have said, is this presentation going to be available? It is. A recording of this will appear on our YouTube channel in a couple of hours. So go to YouTube and search on Nautical Institute, and you'll find this and many other webinars that we've done. You have our email addresses there in front of you. Feel free to write to myself or to Eric. And I hope to see you on one of our courses soon. Like I said, there'll be a little pop-up survey. Please do that, and you will get a CPD certificate in a few hours as well. So thank you very much, Eric. As always, it's fascinating. You know, I could talk to you all day. We have before.
We have. Listen, absolute pleasure. Thanks very much, David. Really appreciate it.
Okay, so why don't you sign off so there's no hiccups in the system, and then I'll close the system for everybody. So thank you very much. Sorry if we didn't get to all the questions, but we'll do what we can. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.